Margaret, thank you so much for being here. We're all really excited to. Have you spent a lot of time in San Antonio?
About 12 hours. No, 6 hours.
That's good. You got a feel for it, I'm sure.
I got a great feel for it. I went for mi tierra for lunch. I had a little margarita just to get me in the mood.
Sounds perfect. Well, this week there's been a lot of focus in the news on John Bolton, former National Security Advisor, and of course he has a new book coming out, which apparently offers some details on why President Trump decided to withhold military aid from Ukraine, and whether he was a reason for that was because he wanted Ukraine to commit to an investigation into Joe and Hunter Biden. And we're hearing there's talk about whether he will testify or not. And as the story has played out this week, and I knew I was going to do this, I was curious, did you, during your time in the Bush administration, did you work with John Bolton at all, or did you have any interactions with him? Or
I had interactions with John Bolton after I was in the White House, but before, let's just be very clear. I was 25 years old in the Bush White House. John Bolton had absolutely no excuse to see me except for to ask me to Xerox his papers. But I have interacted with him. He was a former ambassador of the UN at the time because he was affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute in New York. And I also, even more closely, have interacted with his wife, Gretchen, in the context of setting up a foundation for a mutual friend, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a sort of Muslim dissident, had been a member of parliament in Holland, and now is actually poetically affiliated with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University now, but she's a thinker about reform in Islam as a sort of apostate or dissident who had grown up in a very extremist Muslim community in Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia. So I know the ambassador more by reputation, though I've had a few interactions with him and have been watching these developments very closely because I do believe they're very important for the process that we're going through. I have been disappointed by the talking points on both sides of this impeachment trial. And, but I'm willing to take Republicans at their word as somebody who, I'm still a Republican. I'm not a Trump Republican, just, full disclosure, but I haven't, Republicans, the argument in the House of Representatives was that we cannot support this impeachment because, frankly, there is no firsthand information. There is nobody who has been a witness that saw the president say, hold up this funding for Ukraine until we get an investigation into Joe Biden or Hunter Biden or Burisma. There have been people who testified who believed that that was the reason for the holdup and testify that they believed it was the reason because that's what their superiors told them. But there hasn't been firsthand knowledge of somebody who heard the president say that. And that's what Bolton's testimony purports to offer. Somebody who saw the president say, hold up congressionally appropriated funds until I get a political favor. And so it seems to me that that testimony is enormously relevant to the argument, to the defense of to the argument of whether the president was abusing his power or not. And I suspected, leading into this, that Mitch McConnell, who has a very adept understanding, really since Lyndon Baines Johnson, I think nobody has been a master of the Senate in the way that Leader McConnell is. And some of my favorite books are the Bob Caro books, the Robert Caro books that start in Hill Country, actually. I listened to one of them on audiobook while driving through Hill Country almost this time last year. That mastery that Johnson had of the Senate, Mitch McConnell has. But Mitch can't control everything. And I think you're starting to see a crack in that, in the voices that are saying, we can't really abide not listening to this testimony if a book is going to come out in 4 weeks and say this anyway. You know, it wouldn't be responsible in terms of, you know, our responsibility to our citizens and to our constituents.
On the Democratic side, what has disappointed you with the arguments that they've made?
I did a show with Adam Schiff, and just as an example, you know, this is a political process, all right? This is not a true investigation of people who are in the court of law, who are looking for the information wherever it leads them. This has been imbued by partisanship on the left as well from the very beginning. And I'm not talking about the far left that always wanted to impeach him from the beginning, because certainly that's true, but that's not actually what this is. We wouldn't be here if the president hadn't taken a series of steps that actually got us here. And we're not here because of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We're here because of the president. Adam Schiff has made a series of mistakes by sort of overreaching, I think, in the partisanship and his approach, whereby if he had just, as the chair of the Intelligence Committee, played it as straight as possible, you know, to be getting the information and leaving it to Nancy Pelosi and the others to persuade the public, right? But instead he was sort of trying to message and bring the public along to agree with him while also getting the information, which, you know, you can't actually be the investigator and the prosecutor at the same time, not in a court of law, but that's what he viewed himself as doing. And I think he made a series of missteps. And by the way, many of the Democrats did along the way, and that, I think, you know, just further reveals that this is a political process, but it also confuses ordinary folks who are just trying to follow along.
Here in Texas, I've heard an interesting take from some Republican candidates who I think maybe don't want to get into the details of what President Trump did. They're maybe sidestepping that a little bit. And the take has been, well, we all know how this is going to end up in the Senate, and he's going to stay in office. And so it's really kind of been a waste of time because, you know, nothing is going to come out of it. Congress could be using that time to do something more productive. And I just wondered if you thought that was a valid argument, and I guess it could have been applied maybe in the Clinton impeachment as well. Whether there is an argument to be made for carrying out an impeachment process, even if you know that it's not going to lead to the removal of the president from office.
I think you're right in that, you know, the founders set a very high bar for impeachment for a reason, right? Because the offense had to be so great that an overwhelming majority of the Senate, 67 senators, would have to vote for it. I think we all understand he's going to be acquitted. There's no way you're going to get 67. At least it certainly seems implausible now. The argument the Democrats make is that this is still highly inappropriate behavior for a president, and it would be irresponsible of us not to call this out procedurally in some way. Now, I think the real question there is, what other ways could you have done it? What about a censure?
Right.
What about, I mean, there are other ways of identifying this behavior that is clearly improper. It, to me, seems clearly improper. I mean, George W. Bush would never have done this. I feel very confident in saying that George W. Bush would never have called up an ally and said, yeah, go run this. John Kerry, I know he's been, this is implausible. So there's other things that maybe I think there's a real question to ask. Were there other ways of identifying this behavior as improper, and I think what they wanted to create, you know, a real blemish on his record, and I think maybe he's earned that through this behavior. I don't think anybody is questioning that this call happened, that these favors were asked, that these funds were held up. I think so. I don't know. I think there might have been another way to handle it. Right. That frankly might have been, because I still think his chances of being reelected are actually quite good. Yeah. So not only will you'll have the first president. It's quite plausible that you could have the first president to be impeached and reelected. It's
pretty remarkable when you think about it. Yeah. Now, you in your 2011 book, American Individualism, you kind of looked at how Republicans could attract more millennial voters, and many millennial voters who might be fiscally conservative but more liberal on social issues. And after the 2012 election, I kind of convinced myself that the social conservative wing of the old Reagan coalition, that maybe it was in some ways, it was maybe holding the Republican Party back at this point because it was maybe turning off some younger voters. In 2020 now, I really don't know what to make. I'm really not sure where things stand. I mean, when you look at going back to 2011 and what you were looking at then, is your perspective similar to what it was then on that question?
Yeah, as I said to Arthur earlier today, and by the way, I haven't said thank you to Arthur yet, but Arthur, thank you so much for inviting me here and bringing me here. You've been the most gracious of hosts, as well as your team. I stand by every word I wrote, and it couldn't be more irrelevant now, because the thing I was trying to warn about has happened. I was trying to warn the Republican Party that there's an iceberg ahead. Quick, turn the ship of state. And we just banged in, sideswiped into that iceberg. And now, I think what we know is that millennials and then probably the generation after them, although maybe only the first half of Gen Z. We don't know a lot about Gen Z, and the little bit that we think we know is only the first part of that generation. If you consider a generation's 20 years. They're never going to self-identify as Republicans. There's too many key issues that are turning them off at the front door. The way Republicans, especially the Republican Party now in 2020, is approaching issues of generational importance, like climate change, like LGBT equality, frankly, like immigration. For a generation that at the time I wrote my book was 40% non-white, the tone and the tenor of how we're engaging on the debates and the question of immigration, it just turns them off at the front door. And then we haven't even mentioned, so I was quite concerned about these issues. So I think we've lost them. I think the only way you win people back is not by leading with a label, but talking about ideas. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we try to do at Firing Line, is engage in this contest of ideas and exchange of ideas in the hopes that, through the ideas we can engage people to become involved. And, I don't think the Republican Party is lost forever, but I happen to think it's a bit lost at the moment.
Now, you've been a big advocate for LGBTQ rights, and in a few months, I think we're going to hit the 5th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage in all 50 states. Have you noticed any change in the Republican Party when it comes to that issue? I don't hear as much discussion about the same-sex marriage issue from leading Republicans as I did at the time, when there was a lot of controversy about it. Have you noticed any change?
There's a couple of things you should know. In every place where the polling is done about marriage equality or freedom to marry, which is the language that we used as Republicans, we wanted people, the messaging in order to persuade Republicans that this was a consistent conservative value, was freedom to marry. But everywhere where marriage, the polling on marriage in 2015 it has become stronger since 2015. People are more in favor of it now than they were 5 years ago. And it's just, I think people see people getting married. They see that civilization isn't falling apart.
It's not a threat to your marriage, or
all the sort of some of the main arguments were, which I think people instinctively sort of understood anyway. And I just want to also be very clear that Republicans were critical to that Supreme Court decision, because there was a strategy, a nationwide strategy, to win as many states as possible, both at the ballot box and through legislative measures. So there were states that had Republican legislatures, Republican state senates that voted affirmatively for marriage in their state. There was a really bipartisan effort to demonstrate and to win marriage, both at the ballot box and through at a state-by-state level. And so Republicans were not left. This was, Republicans get short shrift. But there were very strong Republican partners in the fight for marriage equality. And I think you're right. I think the people within the party who were the naysayers and who really fought it tooth and nail have decided that they've lost. It's not worth fighting over that. But the goalposts have moved, and there is real concern, and this is legitimate concern. But the debate now is about religious freedom, and how do you square and protect religious freedom and LGBTQ equality? And I actually think these two things are not incompatible at all. And I think you've seen this with real, true examples in states like Utah, where, you know, it's shocking, but there are 29 states where, you know, minorities are protected because of federal law. Women are protected from being fired in employment discrimination, for example. You can't get fired if you're a woman from your job because you're a woman. You can't get fired from your job because you're disabled, or you're an ethnic minority, or you're a religious minority. We have protections at the federal level in employment non-discrimination, but none for LGBTQ people. So in 29 states, you can be fired for being gay, and it's perfectly legal. And so if you're LGBTQ American living in Texas, you might have a protection within some city ordinances, but you don't have a statewide protection. And you don't have a federal protection. And you don't have that in 28 other states. One of the things that Utah did, before marriage was even passed, they did this in 2013, and Utah is the most religious state in the country. The Mormon Church decided it was going to work together with its legislature, both Democrats and Republicans, to pass a fully comprehensive LGBTQ employment non-discrimination bill that included transgender people, that included gay people. It was Republicans, it was Democrats, it was the Mormon Church, it was other religious leaders, and they decided that they could protect the Mormon Church, that protect Mormon establishments and religious establishments from to being able to practice their religion the way they see fit, while also being able to protect their LGBTQ Utahns. And so the debate on the right now, if you go into conservative circles and you go into conservative think tanks, is, okay, fine, we have marriage, but you see a lot of whittling away at the state level of LGBTQ rights in the form of adoption laws, a lot of bills being passed at the state legislative level for religious freedom that, frankly, are excuses to carve out rights to discriminate against LGBTQ people. And so what I've been working on at the federal level is a balance, a legislation like in Utah that at the federal level will balance religious freedom and protect religious institutions and protect Catholic hospitals and protect, you know, the religious community that is afraid of the federal government overreaching and telling them how to conduct their business and their conscience that would impede on them practicing in their organizations in a way that's consistent with their faith, while still protecting LGBT people from rank discrimination.
How receptive are the members of Congress from what you've seen? So
well, Chris Smith, a Mormon from Utah, is the lead sponsor of this bill. And there are several others who will follow, and I think this actually could become a real issue come November in the Senate, because the Supreme Court will probably rule on a pretty significant case along these lines, and this could actually catalyze the passage of this bill.
On the Democratic side of the presidential race, there's been a lot of discussion about Medicare for All, which has been primarily championed by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And it seems that when people are asked about it, it's pretty popular as a concept. But when people when you go into the details, and particularly when people are asked about giving up their private health insurance, then it becomes less popular. When you look at Medicare for All, do you think it's workable as a policy, and how do you think it would play out in the general election if we have a Democratic nominee who favors that?
I don't think it's workable. Well, it depends. Everybody has it. Again, it's like Baskin-Robbins 31 flavors, whatever. Everybody has their own version of what Medicare for All is. I like John Delaney's Medicare for All. I don't like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren's Medicare for All. But they all call it Medicare for All, but they're actually vastly different policies. And John Delaney's is the least offensive to me. But I don't even think he's running for president anymore. I mean, he certainly hasn't been on the stage. Yeah. Let me tell you who he is. He was a member of Congress from Maryland, so you haven't heard of him because he never made the debate stage, but he was also a healthcare executive. And so he actually understands that the $33 trillion cost that Elizabeth Warren suggested is unworkable. And there are Democrats who also understand that it's unworkable, but they have their own Medicare for all. Things like Mayor Bloomberg says, of course, this is totally unworkable. You can't do this. But his Medicare for all plan involves a public option, and it involves these other things. So look, healthcare is the second largest driver of our debt. It is twice as expensive here as the next most expensive country. And the outcomes that we offer on average are not better. We have a market failure in parts of our healthcare system. There is many firing line programs on how to fix it. And the government taking it over and administering it at enormously high costs, to me, is just so obviously not the answer. And I don't believe that a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren running on Medicare for all will just sit well with the reasonable majority of Americans. None of the polling bears that out.
It looks like the case for President Trump in the November election, a lot of it is going to rest on the strength of the U.S. economy. And your great-grandfather, Herbert Hoover, I think took a lot of blame during the Depression for economic forces that predated his presidency and in many cases were out of his control as president. Now, obviously, the federal government is much larger now and probably has a bigger role in the economy than it did then. But one question that I'm always asking myself, I'm curious to get your take, is how much credit or blame can we give any president when it comes to the U.S. economy?
Thanks for bringing up Herbert Hoover. Can I just say a couple of things about him first before I answer
Absolutely.
that question? Herbert Hoover is like my extracurricular passion project. This is one of the most extraordinary Americans to ascend to the presidency, who pioneered the International Humanitarian Food Relief Organization just as a private citizen when he was 40 years old. By the way, the guy had been an orphan of very, very meager means, was entirely self-made, and just happened to have built this international mining enterprise and been living in London at the outbreak of World War I. And when the Germans invaded Belgium, decided, oh my gosh, realizing that because of the English blockade and the German occupation that refused to feed the occupied population, that 10 million Belgians faced imminent starvation. And that he, as an individual citizen of none of those countries, could do something about it. I mean, it's sort of this extraordinary thing. I mean, he's a Quaker, a pioneer guy, and at that point he knew there was an extraordinary thing here in this country, that he, an orphan of no means, was in a position to be able to do something about 10 million Belgians who faced imminent starvation. And because he actually had this expertise in shipping materials around the globe, because he had mining operations on 5 continents, actually organized within 6 weeks 8,000 tons of wheat to be delivered to Belgium. And he was the only American that was able to cross both sides of the lines throughout the course of World War I, because the Germans knew he was delivering food to the Belgians, which frankly made it a little easier for them to continue occupying the country. And the English knew that he wasn't feeding the Germans, their enemies, because they trusted him as an American that wasn't yet in the war to just be delivering food to the Belgians and not providing food for the enemies. And he had this extraordinary reputation as, this, they called him the Napoleon of mercy, right? That he was there to save people from starvation, and he believed that food would win the war. And probably was the American who ascended to the presidency with the most experience in international relations. I mean, after that, he became so popular as a private citizen, Wilson had to bring him into his cabinet, and then at that point, he didn't know whether he was a Republican or a Democrat. His first donation in politics had been to Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party in 1904. So then he was in Wilson's cabinet, and then he stayed on in Harding's cabinet, and then he was in Coolidge's cabinet, and so he had served Republicans and Democrats, though he never ran for elective office until he ran for president. He ran and won 2 elections. Not unlike our current president.
True.
But that's where the similarities stop. So Hoover, put in plain speak, got a raw deal in terms of his legacy, and I think it's because he was one of the most adept people to ascend to the presidency. He had international economic experience. He understood business. He understood markets. And this depression, which, by the way, he insisted on calling it a depression because there was another word, a recession, that actually had worse political stigma at the time. The irony of ironies. Was the largest calamity in American history since the Civil War. And we didn't have the benefit of modern macroeconomics. We didn't have the tools in our tool belt. We thought it was entire fiscal policy that was going to fix it. And if you talk to Milton Friedman, which you can't because he's passed away, but Milton Friedman, who was a scholar at the Hoover Institution for many years, truly believed that it was Federal Reserve policy and monetary policy that misunderstood that there was a contraction instead of, contracted the money supply, not understanding the actual forces that were occurring, and that the Fed even tinkered with it in ways that it didn't matter how hard Congress tried or how hard Hoover tried. These forces were just too big to understand and to deal with at the time. And it's no coincidence, I think, that Ben Bernanke, who was the head of the Fed when the global financial crisis hit, all of his research had been on the Great Depression and had been on how the Fed could have handled that crisis differently. And there are many, and I do this on my show this week with Paul Krugman, who believe that the Fed policy during the global financial crisis maybe didn't save us from another Great Depression, although Ben Bernanke believes that it did. These are complicated matters. They're hugely, have many, many forces that affect them. And Hoover, I believe, did the best he could, the best that anybody could have at that time, and that Roosevelt did no better. The Depression tanked out even worse in 1936 after Hoover left office, worse than the first dip, and we didn't get out of the Great Depression until World War II. So the New Deal didn't save us, but Roosevelt was hands down a better communicator. I mean, there's just no question. He was a better communicator. Hoover was not a good mass communicator, and Hoover had at least the privilege after Roosevelt's death of being brought back into public service by Harry Truman, serving Truman's administration, serving in Eisenhower's administration, creating 2 Hoover commissions to work towards a streamlining of the federal government, and also feeding Europe after World War II. So all of that to say, thank you very much for letting me talk about Herbert Hoover. But the question was about the economy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, what was the question? I mean, how much credit do you think a president? Obviously, it's different in every situation.
So the Great Depression happened 6 months after Hoover is inaugurated. He's inaugurated on March 4th because we used to inaugurate presidents on in March instead of in January. Right. And then the stock market crashes October 29th, or Black Friday. It was October 20th or October 29th. So of course that wasn't all because of Hoover, but presidents affect the economy, right? I mean, there is, the presidents deserve a degree of credit for things that they do in terms of fiscal policy. But it's not entirely in their control. But the economy now is very strong, and it is hard to say that, confidence is much of what our system works on, whether there is confidence in the economy. And it is true that President Trump has brought confidence to the market.
He's been kind of a salesman for economic growth. So, can I ask you a silly question about your great-grandfather? Yeah. One of the most
silly questions.
One of the most popular TV shows of the 70s, All in the Family, had its opening song, had its lead characters. A lyric from that song was, "We could use a man like Herbert Hoover again."
Rob Reiner was on my program.
Oh. I guess you all talked about this, but was this something that you all laughed about in the family or discussed at all, the fact that this song included a reference to your great-grandfather?
Well, so I'm a little younger, so we didn't.
Sure.
I was born in 1977, and then I wasn't allowed to watch television. So I didn't grow up. I grew up sort of hearing about it, but we didn't grow up watching All in the Family. I think maybe if I were 5 years older, I might have. But I grew up with a lot of irony around Hoover. I definitely grew up with like Hoover, oh, that's unfortunate. Oh, poor her, right? But I grew up knowing two two different sides of the same coin. I mean, I grew up, my history books taught me he caused the Great Depression. I remember writing my college essay on this because, it was Hoover that allowed me to realize that, the things you're spoon-fed in school aren't necessarily true, right? There are, history is written by the winners, right? And so the history books are still enormously kind to FDR. I think in a way that is truly unfair and inconsistent with the history. You might sense a small vendetta against FDR, but he caused the family a lot of pain, which I witnessed, and I just want the truth to be.
I understand they didn't get along too well either. I mean, is that right? I mean.
FDR was going to run for president in 1920, and he wanted Hoover to run for president on the Democratic ticket in 1920, and he offered to be his campaign manager. So they were friends at first,
I see.
And then they weren't. And but many people, Hoover's best friends were Democrats, both Joe Kennedy and Harry Truman, and it's because both of them were also despised by FDR. So they all sort of had this bond.
Well, you've talked a little bit about what you're doing with Firing Line, and you're basically bringing back civil discourse and kind of a respectful exchange of ideas. And I think we all sort of miss that in our public discourse. And I wonder if you have a sense of like how and why that went away, because clearly it went away somewhere along the line.
It certainly went away. It went away on television for sure. I think cable news and the market that drives cable news. There's a profit motive to the split screen and to ratcheting up conflict and then tuning in for conflict and then people going to the cable news channel of their choice, the one that informs them and also reinforces the things that they believe already. And that, I think, has just gotten worse, and I think the political parties play into it. I think the polarization in our politics and our primary process plays into it. So there's an entire ecosystem that includes political parties, it includes cable news channels. There's the media, there's the politics, and I think it artificially drives us apart because I think we have far more in common than we think. And when did it happen? I think it happened throughout the course of the 90s. I think at the emergence of talk radio, which, by the way, I loved. I listened to Rush Limbaugh all the time when I was in high school, when I was not in school. But I think it was around then. I think it really was with the rescinding of the fairness doctrine, which maybe wasn't fair, but it sort of gave way to this new mass market of people who would opine on television and allowed people to sort of cocoon into ecosystems that reinforce their beliefs and not engage with one another. And there's a lot of demonization of the other that happens in all of these places that I think undermines civil discourse. It undermines understanding different points of views, and it's just anathema to what Buckley did 50 years ago.
Right.
And so I think it's strange, but there's no rocket science here. But what's old is new again.
Well, both of you have had a cross section of people people across the political spectrum.
I take my cues from Buckley. Buckley had Jesse Jackson on. He had Groucho Marx on.
Muhammad Ali. Yeah.
He had Muhammad Ali was an amazing show, and it was. Again, that was. And it was he was respectfully engaging with people he fundamentally disagreed with, but they both got to say what they thought, and everybody heard both sides. And I think, there's enormous value of that, particularly now when we feel more polarized than ever.
I want to turn things over to the audience, but I had one final question for you. You've talked about how this presidency is unprecedented, just the way in which this president conducts himself and communicates and various other things. When you think about a post-Trump United States, do you think that the traditional norms, political and governing norms, will return, or is this the new normal?
God, I hope so. I really believe that much of what we've seen is actually just spun out from who Donald Trump is as a person, and what we haven't seen are a whole generation of mini Trumps successfully doing engaging in the same way and the same tactics that he has. I think you've seen people try, and you've certainly seen people take notes from his tone and tenor. But I don't see it. I don't see. Look, when I look at the Republican House of Representatives, or the Republicans in the House of Representatives, because remember, it's not Republican anymore because Republicans lost the House of Representatives because of Trump. I don't see a series of mini Trumps. I see 100 new women, and they're all Democrats. That's what happened. So I do have some faith that this is, this odd occurrence that is related specifically to the personality and the
Right.
idiosyncrasy of this person, this man who's the president now. And it's funny, I remember the only thing I can liken it to in recent history, or maybe even in 20th century history, is, and forgive me for the partisanship here, but I've been to every Republican nominating convention since 2000. And I remember Dick Cheney saying in Philadelphia that, because remember there was this, whether you agree now in hindsight that President Clinton should have been impeached or not, Dick Cheney said on the nominating stage, the day, the moment, the minute that George Bush steps into the Oval Office will be the day, the moment, the minute that integrity is restored to the office of the presidency. Right. Because there was this real feeling amongst Republicans that Bill Clinton's improper personal behavior had demeaned the office. And that's what I hope for in the next president, whoever he or she is, that there is a return to norms and a respect for the history and the traditions and the reverence for the office and the prestige of the office and the traditions of the office that will return because of the person that inhabits the office next.
Great. Well, we're going to turn things over to the audience for questions, and if you can come up to the mic over here to our right.
Can you believe what a wonderful guest we have in Margaret Hoover and Gilbert? Thank you so much. You probably wouldn't believe that this wonderful lady is a mother of 2 children. Her son is Jack, and her daughter is Tula Lou, 4 and 6 years old. She looks like she's just out of kindergarten herself.
I knew I liked you, Arthur.
But I'd like to invite many of you, all of you, to come up and ask Margaret a question. I have the first one but first let me recognize, I wouldn't be here if it hadn't have been for Bill Maul, who hired me to be a cameraman in 1965 for KLRN. Sorry, Bill. Thank you, Bill. I didn't know what I was doing, and he didn't hire me the second time, but I came back to work at KLRN anyway. Margaret, in your book, you talk about the millennials and the impact that they're facing, especially now with the debt. And I read with great interest out of your book, I think it's on page 72, that politicians ignore problems until they become crises. And even then, political will might not emerge to fix them. Unfortunately, in the absence of obvious evidence that our deficits and our debt have reached the crisis stage, there is no political will to tackle the problem. But make no mistake, a crisis is looming. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, this is. I identify with the center right partly because of this sense of responsibility and intergenerational fiscal responsibility, and it concerns me that. Let me back up. Our national debt is $23 trillion. The CBO just came out with estimates on Tuesday, while I was in the middle of taping my show with Paul Krugman, that the deficit this year will be over $1 trillion. I hate to continue hitting on Republicans lest you think I'm not a Republican anymore, but Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate have done precious little with a Republican president to curtail spending, the thing that we all seem to have had in common previously. I think now that Paul Ryan's not there, there's really no one to hold back the spending, although Paul Ryan, even in his last 2 years, was able to do little to hold back the spending. And this is one of the issues I think that that I think concerns the millennial generation and the children below them, because with baby boomers retiring, with healthcare costs skyrocketing, with its demographics, its healthcare costs, and then just sort of global economic forces, we are not going to be able to pay for all the things we want. We pay on the interest on the debt, we pay $390 billion a year. That's just interest on the debt. That's almost more than we spend in education, in many of our discretionary programs. Within 10 years, it will be the size of the defense budget. This is not the way any of us would run our homes. It's not the way any of us run our homes, and yet we are not paying attention to investing in our future and taking care of our fiscal house. Our fiscal house is not in order, and that's going to hit the next generation because in a sound fiscal foundation connects directly to an economy that is vibrant and growing. And without one, you can't have the other. How are we going to be leaving, and how am I going to leave to my children? How are all of us going to leave an economy that can continue to grow and continue to provide the opportunities and the mobility to the next generation if we aren't more responsible with our spending? And the answer is that we won't be able to. And it's pretty basic. I mean, we have to get healthcare spending in order, but there are other things that we can do as well. But healthcare is one of the biggest drivers of the debt, including, and in addition to the demographics. And this is something that I hope the next iteration of Republicans will rediscover. Although, it's interesting. It's mostly been when you have mixed party that has and a crisis that has solved it. Well, you had Reagan and Tip O'Neill cut a deal over Social Security because it was about to not be able to pay out checks. This was going to be a huge political problem for both of them, and they were able to reason together and redo Social Security in 1986.
I would think, too, the challenge on the political side is that solutions to long-term problems, whether it's climate change or the debt, these are things you don't necessarily get points for in the short term. People might not necessarily see the impact on their lives, the positive impact on their lives in the short term, and so maybe there's not as much incentive for politicians to take the responsible actions. Is that fair to say, you think?
I think that's right, although I do think you see a generation that's quite concerned about climate change. Mm-hmm. And then you see, so I think it's about educating. I think there's an education element to this. But as soon as you have sort of people talked about it more after the global financial crisis, when 37% of millennials were at home on their parents' couches, because they weren't. It's not that they weren't employable; there just weren't enough jobs because we had this contraction and unemployment was very high, and they were the least employable. And so there are moments where I think it comes in to define our focus, right. And it's up to politicians to have courage to actually pursue policies that will solve these problems.
Yes, sir.
Margaret, hi, my name is Harold Oliver. I'm a board member at KLRN. You're welcome here anytime.
Thanks for having me.
We should do this regularly. And as a side, I was general counsel to a senator in Austin when W was governor. So if you ever want some anecdotes about my meetings with W, they're pretty interesting. I'd like to hear your thoughts, putting on your feminist hat, and your thoughts on the selection of Supreme Court Justice and whether or not you thought the selection process that Justice Kavanaugh went through was fair to him and or to the women that were on the other side.
This is the third rail. I'm just going to apologize. And look, this I will answer your question. I'll tell you what I thought. I said this a lot on CNN. I got a lot of hate mail for it, but I will tell you. And I just apologize in advance if I offend anybody. We can have different points of view, and we can still move forward. And now I'm trying to reacquaint myself with all of the dynamics of that. But essentially, my view was the following. I believed that Justice Kavanaugh, how do I say this? I'll tell you this. I was on set at CNN after Christine Blasey Ford testified. And then Justice Kavanaugh, I think then they took a break and Justice Kavanaugh responded after all of his hearings. And I actually, just by bad luck or good luck or some kind of luck, Jake Tapper came to me first and said, what did you think? And I said, I think what you saw in Christine Blasey Ford was a woman who was speaking her truth and recounting a series of events that she believes happened to her. And I am not the person to question what she believes happened to her. On the other side of that coin, I knew Brett Kavanaugh a little bit in the White House. He was the staff secretary when I worked there. I had enormous respect for him, as did everybody that worked for him. I don't know what he did in high school. I don't know how much he drank. I don't know what happened in that room. Nobody does. And what I also believed is that I know how he had conducted himself since then, which was as an upstanding citizen who had performed remarkably at every stage of his life. And I felt that it was fundamentally unfair for him to have gotten as far as he did and then have an accusation that was ultimately completely unprovable derail this otherwise perfectly qualified nominee. Now, I recognize that I'm probably one of the few people who has made that argument. From one of the few, women who has made that argument. But I did really identify with Susan Collins' statement on the floor that said, ultimately, we have to have a process that is fair and open and transparent, and we have done the best we can to get to the root of what happened, but there are some things that are just not going to be knowable. And based on everything in front of us, it didn't seem to me appropriate that he should not be a member of the court because of an unprovable accusation from more than 20 years prior. I don't believe that can be the next standard for every person serving in public office. Does that mean that I thought his performance was perfect when he got back up in front of the senators to defend himself? No.
Do you think that, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but do you think that was, because there's been some suggestion that that's really not what he's normally like, but that maybe he was egged on a little bit by the Trump administration?
Well, I know exactly what, yes, I think that was part of it. I think, first of all, knowing him and knowing his wife a little bit, he was angry, and I would have been angry too. Now, that anger played terribly on television. Anger never looks good. It is just never a good look. But I understand why I was angry. And I also, there is this sense that Trump had said, go out and fight him, Tiger, right? The way he told Sean Spicer in the first day, go out and tell him there were 10 million people on the mall, right? And Sean Spicer did and made a fool out of himself. But I don't think that's what Brett was doing. I do think there was a little bit of playing to an audience of one, but mostly I think he was angry and felt that he had been unfair. And also, the Republican senators did a terrible job of sort of handling that whole thing. I don't know if we're getting really in the weeds here, but there was one moment where Lindsey Graham kind of took the stage and ran with it, right? And then Lindsey was the angry one, and what Lindsey Graham was doing was being the angry one. So Brett didn't have to be the angry. Brett could look like the civilized, Supreme Court justice. And Lindsey could suggest that this process has been hijacked and this is really unfair. But look, it was an event, I think, in our common shared experience that triggered many people. You know, I still have friends I can't talk about it with. You know, and again, like this is, you know, what we hope, you know, and I think, frankly, and I'm saddened to say this, I do think his tenure as a Supreme Court Justice will always be sort of shadowed and smeared by this event that happened in the course of his swearing in. And that's unfortunate, deeply unfortunate sort of for him, and bad for the country. And these are the unfortunate times we live in.
Margaret, a comment first and then a question. The comment is, I want to thank you, as I said to you earlier, for making the link with William F. Buckley on the firing line and playing the archival footage, but also making it relevant to what your discussions in the show. I think that's one of the great things about it, and I think the legacy of Firing Line in encouraging and fostering civil discourse is vastly needed today. The question is, what's it going to take to get a woman elected president this country?
Nikki Haley? Thank you. I'll answer that. But just thank you for pointing out that we include William F. Buckley Jr. in every program. Because the truth is, William F. Buckley Jr. is the longest host of any television series in American television history. He hosted Firing Line longer than Johnny Carson hosted the Today Show, the Nightly Show, the Today Show. No, not the Today Show. The Tonight Show. The Tonight Show. Johnny Carson was at night. And everything that we want to talk about with a guest on Firing Line today, Buckley dealt with in some way on one of his programs, because there were 1,505 episodes, and they are all available at the Hoover Institution. They're not all digitized, but with enough advance notice, I can get them digitized. Sometimes I don't have that much notice, but I knew I was going to have H.R. McMaster when I had him, and I had enough lead warning that I went and digitized his Firing Line from when he was a young buck. It hadn't actually been digitized, so we are slowly but surely. 300 of the originals are digitized from the most high-profile people, but H.R. McMaster wasn't high-profile enough in 2004 when they received the collection. So thank you for that. I think it's important to demonstrate editorially that the arguments and not the arguments, but the discourse and the debates that we're having now are not new debates. And the arguments on both sides of those debates continue. And sometimes one side has learned from something. Sometimes circumstances have changed. One of these areas where it's blatantly obvious is in the context of race relations. Any of the shows where Buckley deals with racism, race relations, racial disparities, I mean, those are very dated shows. But for the most part, these issues are recurring, and we can learn something from the way Buckley engaged with his guests in the original Firing Line series. I think the same country that elected Barack Obama could elect a woman. And I believe it just takes the right person at the right time. And it could be next time, or it could be in 2 or 3 or 5 times. And it's hard to predict what sort of climate forces will conspire to create that. But I believe we're fully capable of electing women. I don't believe that we're so sexist that we couldn't. But I do believe there are forces that make it tough for women. It would be a very extraordinary woman, and sort of an exception, an exceptional woman. Will be the first woman president. It was, you know, it's easy to say in hindsight it was never going to be Hillary Clinton, but, you know, I think it was going to be always very difficult for Hillary Clinton, who had always been a polarizing figure in our politics, to be the first female president.
What about Elizabeth Warren if she's the Democratic nominee? What do you think her prospects would be?
I think they're very little.
Okay.
I think they're very small. Mm. I think they're very small, and it's not because she's a woman, but I just can't, you know, look, you got to win 50+1. I mean, actually, you don't have to win 50+1, because the Trump administration's strategy and the Trump campaign strategy is just to win the Electoral College. Mm-hmm. She could be. 78,000 votes in 3 states is how Donald Trump won. I mean, we're on a knife's edge. it's entirely, whoever is the Democratic nominee could be the next president. It's not impossible. But in the way that President Obama was this unifying, transcendent figure because he was the first African American and he was able to inspire the reasonable edge of the opposition, he had a completely new coalition built around his candidacy. It's very difficult to see how Elizabeth Warren builds a new broad coalition, especially when the economy is as good as it is, running on the ideas that she's running on.
I just want to talk a little bit about there are two things that I think need to be solved, and that it doesn't seem like either of the parties are dealing with them directly, are the fact that our infrastructure is in terrible condition, and two, and maybe juxtaposition to that, we have an immigration problem where we have got thousands and thousands of people on the border who are willing and want to work. We've got thousands of them here in America that want to work, and at the type of jobs that infrastructure could put them to work. And I just, I wonder why that hasn't occurred to anybody, that could be a solution. And plus the fact that global immigration is going to be probably the biggest problem of our future, because of climate change forcing people out of where they are into other places, and it's going to be a problem all over the world. So I'm just
You sound so reasonable.
I'm a Democrat.
I'll remind you that it was George W. Bush who sincerely tried in 2007 to get a comprehensive immigration bill passed with Democrats, Ted Kennedy leading. And that there are very reasonable people, or there in the past have been reasonable people on both sides of this debate. And I appreciate that that is not the case in Washington right now, and it hasn't been the case in Washington for some time, probably since 2007, as it turns out. And it's for me, it's an issue. I mean, I was telling Arthur today, my grandmother was born right on the border of Mexico and Arizona when Arizona was a territory, not a state. She lived a day's buggy ride south of Tucson. So she grew up bilingual. My dad spoke Spanish, I spoke Spanish. I've studied and lived in Mexico and Bolivia. I've known people from both of those countries who have come here, both legally and eventually not legally, to work and to contribute and send money home and to be part of a vibrant economy, because they don't have the kind of economic opportunity that we have here in their home country, and it breaks my heart. And I have a chapter on immigration reform in my book, which is, a version of, many other people's ideas of how you could do it. And you suggested another plausible suggestion, which is that these jobs could go for infrastructure, and then you solve two problems, not just one. I didn't write about infrastructure because bridges weren't crumbling when I wrote my book, but this is another thing we have to. I don't know that we will ever fix some of the most critical issues in front of us if we don't change the way we have primaries in this country, because the parties are so polarized because they're so afraid of their radical bases. And, political courage comes at a cost. And so, and who's going to turn out in March 3rd for a primary except for this radical motivated, contingent that cares about one issue? And that's a state-by-state process. It's super comprehensive. It's really difficult. There are thoughtful philanthropists trying to figure out how to do it. And there are a lot of solutions. It's not like people don't have the ideas. It's not like Lindsey Graham doesn't know how to fix it, or anybody in Congress knows how to fix it that's reasonable. When you get them in a closed door without the tape recorder on, everybody knows it's an issue and they know we have to fix it. But the politics is poison. And by the way, both sides want to win on the politics, and they care more about winning on the politics than they do ultimately. I mean, even the Gang of Eight, right? We had a Senate bill in 2013 that, so we've been close, but not close enough. And I lament that, and I agree with you.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to stop. And if you all could please help me thank Margaret Hoover for being a wonderful guest. Thank you so much.
Gilbert, one last question.
Okay,
This is
sure.
my younger
Yes,
brother,
sir.
and I wanted
Thank you.
to get him in.
Okay.
Thank you. I feel stronger now because this lady was a Democrat and I'm accused of being one as well. However, I appreciated your conversation with Michael Moore. You couldn't have been two more opposite people in that program. I watch you religiously every week, and when I can't watch you, I put you on DVR so that I can pick you up later. And I was interested in your repartee with him on the Electoral College. And even though you took two opposite positions, I'm wondering what you think of the problem we have with the legislatures in each of the states gerrymandering their districts, and whether you would agree with the idea of nonpartisan commissions to choose.
Nonpartisan redistricting commissions are one way to do it. Of course, the devil's in the details for all of these things, right? Sometimes these nonpartisan redistricting commissions, under the guise of being nonpartisan, aren't nonpartisan at all. I mean, you all in Texas know better than anyone. I think, didn't the term gerrymandering come from here? Isn't Jerry from here? Like, and it's, I mean, it's not, and Republicans and Democrats have both been responsible for it. I mean, I know, Karl Rove was my boss in the White House, and I heard all about all the crazy maps that were drawn, and so I think it's how it's done. Is it a truly nonpartisan commission, and what are the results? And there are places where it's been more successful than in other places. I know a little bit about it because my husband is a huge supporter of it. My husband is a radical centrist, and he is actually, I think, on an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission in New York. Is he on it? I think he is. So look, I think the Supreme Court sort of passed on looking at this issue. There's a case in Wisconsin and a case in Maryland, both egregious examples of Republicans gerrymandering a state and winning, and Democrats gerrymandering a state and consistently winning in a way that doesn't represent the populace of their states, but disproportionately has Democrats or Republicans in their in the Congress. And ultimately, I think it's going to be a matter for the court. The Supreme Court is going to ultimately have to decide, because I don't see. And then you'll go state by state with these. I think independent redistricting commissions in the states where you can get them have been a solution that most people have been pleased with, except for the losing side, right? Because the incentive is never, on the side that ends up with less representation. So it's tricky, and so I think it's if you have confidence in the independent commission, then it's a solution. I think that's TBD.